The air inside Susa is thick with the scent of wealth and fear. You stand in the courtyard of the Achaemenid palace, where cedar wood gleams and gold leaf catches the desert light, but this grandeur is a deceptive shield. The true empire, the secret empire, lies hidden deep within, behind walls of thick stone and silk-draped doors, the royal harem. This is not merely a residence for women, it is a meticulously designed political machine, a psychological prison disguised as a pleasure garden, where absolute authority mutates into absolute transgression. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict, without depicting explicit or graphic events. The power we speak of belongs to Xerxes I, the king of kings, ruler of an empire stretching from the borders of India to the shores of Greece. He commanded armies, built monuments, and possessed the power of life and death over millions. He was the living embodiment of Ahura Mazda's will on earth. Yet, even for a god on earth, certain boundaries, of nature, of family, of decency, were understood to be inviolable. These were the ultimate societal taboos that defined civilization, even in antiquity. When a man reaches the zenith of power, when all external conquest and gratification become routine, the soul often turns inward, seeking new boundaries to shatter simply to feel the shock of life. This is the moment when power stops being a tool of governance and becomes a corrosive acid. We begin this excavation of history not on the bloody fields of Salamis, where Xerxes suffered naval defeat, but in a small, suffocating chamber of the harem. The only sound is the rustle of silk and the faint, rhythmic shake of a servant's hand applying perfumed oil. The hands tremble not from cold, but from the chilling knowledge of what awaits. The object of this silent dread is a young girl, barely entering womanhood, her collarbones sharp beneath her veil. She is Xerxes's daughter, born within the labyrinthine confines of the royal quarters, a child of a secondary concubine. Unlike the daughters of royal wives, she possesses no political status, no future marriage alliance to a prince or noble house. Her existence is caught in a terrifying gray zone, carrier of the sacred royal blood, yet treated as property, a line item in the harem's inventory. To understand the tragedy, you must first comprehend the system that produced it. The Persian harem was a state within a state, administered with surgical precision by eunuchs, men stripped of lineage and ambition, bound only to the king's will. They were the silent architects of Xerxes's domestic dominion, controlling access, food, jewels, and most critically, all information. They were the gatekeepers of the king's secret. The women within this cage, princesses, musicians, concubines, were continually transformed. They were trained in the arts of refined obedience, dance, and diplomacy. Some sought influence, using whispers and glances to affect imperial policy, knowing that a misstep could mean instant, silent oblivion. It was a golden cage where autonomy was forfeited the moment you stepped across the threshold, exchanged for luxury and the slim chance of wielding power. When Xerxes returned from his humiliating military campaigns against Greece, his psyche was fractured. He had failed to conquer the external world. Now, he became obsessed with establishing divine, unquestionable rule over the only realm he could still absolutely control, the harem. This turning inward signaled the shift from king to tyrant, from powerful ruler to psychological predator. The seeds of corruption were already visible in his outside relationships, recorded in hushed tones by historians like Herodotus. Xerxes was rumored to have fixated on the wife of his own brother, Menes. When she resisted his advances, Xerxes cruelly redirected his desire toward her daughter, his own niece, forcing her into a forbidden relationship. The king, who saw himself as a god, began to view family lines and sacred relationships as mere extensions of his limitless will. Minihook's shift asterisk this obsession with his brother's family was only the beginning. It established a chilling pattern. If the daughters of his relatives were merely trophies for his use, what boundary was left for the daughters born within his own walls, already catalogued as property? As these girls, the silent princesses of the harem, grew older, their ambiguous status became their sentence. They were not married off. They were not allowed to leave. They remained within the reach of the same man who had sired them, an unmoving inventory waiting for an unspoken purpose. The air thickened with unspoken knowledge. The mothers knew, the eunuchs knew, and the system of absolute silence ensured survival. Even the moral codes of the ancient world held certain relationships as universally forbidden. In Persia, certain marriages between close relatives were sometimes permitted to keep the royal bloodline pure, but the union of father and daughter was the final, profound line, the great taboo. It was a boundary so fundamental that even the cruelest tyrants across history rarely dared to cross it. But for Xerxes, the ultimate allure was precisely this, to break the final boundary. It was the last remaining act that proved his total dominion. It was a declaration that he stood above all human, natural, and even divine law. Possessing everything meant that true gratification could only be found in transgression, in forcing the world, and his own blood, to bend to his corrupted desire. When you enter the secluded chambers of the king, you enter a place where morality has been replaced by logistic. The eunuchs, whose sole duty was obedience, prepared these girls for him. There was no internal check, no mechanism for dissent. The architecture of the harem, designed for secrecy with its hidden corridors and isolated wings, ensured that the deepest acts of corruption remained invisible to the outside world. How could one resist a man who was simultaneously your father, your king, and your living deity? For the daughters, coercion was absolute. They had been raised in the very ideology that demanded their complete submission. Their entire existence was a function of the king's needs, an industrial process of obedience designed to culminate in this terrible moment. This was not simple lust. It was a psychological need for total possession. Xerxes, burdened by his failures abroad and drowning in unchecked power, had completed the process of dehumanization. His daughters were not family. They were the most exclusive, most potent symbols of his sovereignty, the final proof that his dominion had no limit, even over the vessels of his own creation. Mini-hook shift * 10 years later, the consequences of this inner rot would begin to manifest externally. The empire, weakened by a king who prioritized inner depravity over effective governance, was swaying, hollow at its core, long before its final enemy approached. As the years passed, Xerxes increasingly neglected the affairs of state. The satraps, his provincial governors, began to act with the independence of petty kings, exploiting the people. The great Persian colossus was losing its moral authority, and the harem, once a radiant symbol of royal reach, became the tomb of the king's sanity, where countless young lives were quietly crushed in ritual silence. The nameless daughters, broken by the man who should have protected them, became silent ghosts wandering the marble halls, the unacknowledged witnesses to the moral collapse of the most powerful figure on earth. A system built on fear and forced silence is inherently unstable. Its final act is always to turn and devour itself. The internal structure that protected Xerxes' secrets now began to facilitate his downfall. By 465 BC, the patience of the Persian elite had worn thin. Xerxes' end would not come from a Greek spear, but from the shadows within his own fortress. The chief conspirator was Artabanus, the captain of the royal guard, the man who stood closest to the king, and thus the man who knew too much of the unspeakable truths behind the locked doors. Artabanus worked in concert with Aspatenes, a high-ranking eunuch, one of the very administrators of the depravity Xerxes had cultivated. The corruption had reached the heart of the security system. The men tasked with protecting the king's life and his secrets now saw his continued existence as a greater danger to the empire than his death. One night, Artabanus entered the royal chambers. The act was swift, brutal, and silent. The man who had believed himself a god, who had broken every natural law to prove his divinity, died beneath the blade of his own servant. The forced silence of the harem was suddenly shattered by the echoes of panic screams as the palace erupted into a brief, violent civil war. Paragraph 23. The aftermath was chaos. Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes I, moved quickly to secure the throne, immediately executing his elder brother, Darius, on false charges of parricide. In a single night, the cycle of violence and suspicion renewed itself. The throne was secured under a new master, but the women of the harem, those hundreds of lives, were left behind, forgotten among the debris of divine blood. The daughters were not liberated, they were simply transferred, property of one dead tyrant now belonging to another. The death of their abuser marked only the transfer of ownership. The psychological machinery of the harem, designed for total control and silent submission, continued to turn, untouched and unchallenged, proving that the system was stronger than the man who created it. What legacy did Xerxes leave behind? Not a stronger empire, but a humiliated one, defeated abroad and rotting from within. The architectural grandeur of Persepolis and Susa remained, but the soul of the kingdom was extinguished. His most terrifying legacy was not his palaces, but the hereditary disease of absolute power itself, poisoning every generation. History records the names of kings, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, and later, Alexander the Great, who would ultimately burn Persepolis to the ground. But history does not remember a single name of Xerxes' daughters born in the harem. They remain nameless forever, ghosts in the margins, silent statistics of the true cost of unchecked power. Their existence survives only as grotesque whispers in the works of foreign historians, a haunting reminder that humanity's greatest moral failures often occur not in open conflict, but in locked chambers, protected by ritual, luxury, and the complicity of an entire, obedient system. The Persian harem, therefore, was not a relic of one man's depravity. It was the most refined machine ever built for the purpose of erasure and control. It did not rely on chains or iron bars. Its shackles were silk, its guards were smiles, and its laws were written in the language of devotion to the King of Kings. Its genius was that everyone inside believed they were serving something sacred, even as that service required the destruction of human dignity, identity, and moral boundaries. That is the final, agonizing paradox of absolute power. It promises divinity, but inevitably delivers decay. It builds monumental palaces while simultaneously hollowing the hearts of those who dwell within them, and in the end, it always consumes its own creator, leaving behind a system ready for the next tyrant. The invisible harem still exists. Wherever power concentrates absolutely, wherever transparency is denied, wherever a group of people is stripped of their humanity and turned into property, the pattern repeats. The ruins of Persepolis may be silent, but silence was always the true language of the harem. It was silence that hid the crimes, silence that preserved the throne, silence that buried the names of the daughters who never escaped. If this story made you reflect on how easily power turns to cruelty, stay with us. Subscribe for the next chapter from the darker corners of human history. The true tragedy of Xerxes is not that he broke the ultimate taboo, but that the structure around him was designed to applaud him for it. We must look beyond the golden dust of history's triumphs and listen for the echoes of the silenced voices. For if we do not learn to listen to them, the invisible structures of control will be rebuilt again and again. The only difference between ancient tyranny and modern corruption is the choice of material. The function remains the same.